The gavel struck wood, and the room jolted. Voices climbed over one another, neighbors I had known for a decade, now pointing, whispering, choosing sides. On the projector, my name stood beside a motion no one had warned me about: eject Emily Carter for repeated violations, disruptive conduct, and reputational harm to the community, as if my divorce were vandalism on every mailbox. My name is Emily Carter. I was 42, lived in Austin, Texas, and taught high school English. That night in the community hall, my private life lay under fluorescent lights, pinned like a specimen. I had thought the end of a marriage would create distance. Instead, it tightened every boundary line around me. Richard stood at the lectern in his blue suit. He didn't look at me. He spoke like a public service announcement, calm, grave, reasonable. "This is about compliance," he said. "We all follow the same rules." It was the voice I once trusted to steady a life. Now it flattened facts until they were easy to step on. Beside him, the board's president, Valerie Shaw, nodded, a reluctant smile arranged for the camera. They placed a stack of glossy photos on the table, a trash can visible from the street, a dog off leash for 20 seconds, a holiday wreath past the permitted date, tiny things, strung together to look like a chain. Every picture had a timestamp. None had context. I recognized the angles. Someone had been filming me. The crowd pressed in with whispers. In the third row, a husband and wife sat with two empty chairs between them. Across the aisle, a neighbor studied her phone, avoiding her spouse's eyes. I took the floor because my legs carried me there. "You're voting to expel me from the neighborhood I helped teach," I said. Over a wreath and a garbage can. A few laughed, nervously laughter that asked permission. I didn't look at Richard until I had to. When our eyes met, he wore that apologetic crease that had closed 1,000 arguments. Tonight, it asked the room to forgive what he was about to do. Valerie tapped the mic. "This isn't personal." Her gaze flickered toward Richard. "It's about protecting property values." A man in the back raised his hand. "If this isn't personal, why did Mr. Carter draft the agenda item?" The board murmured. Richard answered smoothly about efficiency and service. Then came the letters. Valerie read them like verdicts, each from a different neighbor, repeating the same phrases: disruptive, hostile, non-compliant. The signatures were familiar people who had borrowed my ladder, eaten my pecan pie, asked me to grade their children's essays. The sentences looked copied, their rhythm too neat. I saw a template more than a voice. Motion to proceed to a vote. Richard said, "Second." Valerie replied. Something small and hard lodged beneath my breastbone. Not fear recognition. The choreography was too clean. The photographs, the letters, the agenda in a lawyer's hand. This wasn't deliberation, it was a performance staged for one outcome. I raised my hand. "Before you vote, I want the minutes to reflect 3 facts. 1, I received no notice of this agenda item. 2, Mr. Carter and Ms. Shaw have met privately multiple times this month with no record as board business. 3, I have reason to believe HOA funds have been used for purposes not authorized under the bylaws." The room caught fire. Heads snapped. Valerie's smile froze. Richard finally looked at me and recoiled a millimeter before smoothing it over. "Let's not make accusations," he said. "If Ms. Carter has concerns, there are proper channels. Proper channels." The phrase tasted like a locked door. I didn't push further. Not here. The decision they wanted tonight was a verdict masquerading as procedure. And if teaching teenagers had taught me anything, it was this: truth is easier to catch when the liar thinks you've stopped looking. "Table the vote," someone shouted. Others hissed. The gavel struck again, frantic, then slower. Valerie announced a recess. People stood in clusters, every circle a rumor factory. I stepped back from the lectern, my heartbeat settling as a different timeline overlaid the present like tracing paper. To understand how a marriage could turn a neighborhood into a battlefield, you need to see the first thread I pulled. It began 3 months earlier, with an envelope slid under my door at 6:12 a.m. The envelope was thin, unmarked, and slid under my door before the sun had cleared the rooftops. Inside was a violation notice on HOA letterhead improper lawn ornamentation. Attached was a grainy photo of a clay pot my daughter had painted when she was 10. It sat on the porch, a swirl of turquoise and gold, harmless as a seashell. According to the board, it diminished uniformity. According to me, it was a relic of family still intact. I read it twice. My pulse didn't quicken until I saw the signature line, prepared by counsel Richard Carter. He hadn't even bothered with subtlety. Our divorce decree had been signed 6 weeks earlier. He had moved 4 streets away, technically outside my line of sight, but never out of reach. And now he was drafting violations against me under the HOA banner. When I confronted Valerie Shaw, the board president, she smiled as if she were humoring a student late with an essay. "We can't control who the HOA retains for legal advice," she said. "Mr. Carter has been generous with his time." Generous, I asked. "Or self-serving," she tilted her head. "Let's not confuse personal matters with community governance." But I saw the manicure, the watch, the tilt of her chair toward Richard's name when she said it. This wasn't about a clay pot. It was about drawing borders between what was mine and what Richard wanted erased. Neighbors began noticing. At the mailbox cluster, an older man whispered, "He's got half the board in his pocket." A mother walking her dog muttered, "Careful. She's on his list." I became the cautionary tale: what happened if you stopped orbiting Richard Carter. The second violation arrived 3 days later, this time for noise disturbance. The evidence, a brief recording of my window fan humming at night. I knew the angle of the file. It had to have been taken from Richard's side of the fence, where he once grilled steaks for my birthday. Each notice built a scaffold, not enough to topple me outright, but tall enough to shadow my life. At school, I rehearsed lectures with composure, but the moment the bell rang, my mind returned to the subdivision gates. One evening, I drove past the clubhouse and saw Richard through the glass doors. He was leaning across the conference table toward Valerie, papers spread before him. Her laughter snapped across the pane. They didn't look like adversaries hammering out bylaws. They looked like co-conspirators, scripting the next act. It was then I understood the tactic. He wasn't just using the HOA as a weapon, he was building an audience. If enough people believed I was trouble, the rest would follow. And if the HOA decreed it, it would wear the polish of legitimacy. I told myself to breathe, to wait, to gather. My grandmother used to say, "When people think you're cornered, that's when they reveal their true map." I had to let Richard believe the walls were closing in. But then came the whisper that turned suspicion into resolve. At a block gathering, I overheard 2 neighbors in hushed tones. One said, "She's fighting him alone. He's got Valerie, and you know about the others." The pause carried weight. The others weren't board members. They were spouses, neighbors entangled in affairs, favors traded like currency. By the time I returned home, the porch pot looked different under the lamplight, not an ornament, but evidence. Richard wasn't dismantling me out of spite. He was using me as the first stone in a wall of secrecy he needed to protect. That night, as I filed the violation notices into a binder, I made a silent vow. If he wanted a battlefield, he would have one, but it wouldn't be fought on his terms. The next morning, another envelope appeared. This one wasn't official, no letterhead, just a folded sheet of paper in neat block letters. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." The anonymous note didn't leave my hand all morning. I carried it in my purse, then tucked it in my desk drawer at school, sliding it beneath stacks of essays on Macbeth. Students wrote about ambition turning to ruin, blind hunger for power. I underlined their words with a red pen and wondered if they saw what I was living through. When the last bell rang, I drove home slower than usual. scanning rearview mirrors. Every sedan behind me felt deliberate, every glance too long. The neighborhood gates clicked open, and I imagined eyes peering from every drawn curtain. The subdivision had become a stage, and I was cast as the villain in Richard's production. I placed the note on my kitchen counter and stared at it while the kettle hissed. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." It was meant to sound anonymous, but it carried Richard's cadence. He used to phrase warnings like that in arguments cool, rehearsed, as though he were dictating a legal memo rather than speaking to his wife. That night, I heard a car idle near the curb. Headlights flashed across the blinds, then disappeared. I checked the porch. The clay pot was still there, glowing faintly under the street lamp. For a moment, I considered bringing it inside. Then I thought of my daughter, the last time she'd seen it, the way her fingers smudged turquoise across the rim. I left it where it was. 2 days later, the HOA newsletter landed in every mailbox. On the second page was a column titled Community Harmony. It spoke of compliance, of maintaining standards, of removing disruptive influences. The language was formal, but the subtext screamed my name. Richard had written it. I recognized his legal rhythm. He was drafting me out of the neighborhood, one paragraph at a time. At the next board session, Valerie greeted me with the careful courtesy of someone handling glass. "We'd appreciate if you didn't disrupt the meeting," she said before I'd even sat down. Disrupt. The word had been chosen, planted, rehearsed. Richard presented a new motion and amendment tightening restrictions on exterior decor, noise levels, and community conduct. It read like a manual for criminalizing daily life. Valerie seconded it with a nod that felt choreographed. But I noticed something else. Across the room, 2 board members avoided eye contact. One fiddled with a pen, the other glanced toward the door as though calculating escape. They weren't comfortable. They weren't all in lockstep. When Richard finished, I stood. If this amendment passes, anyone could be targeted for anything. A child's birthday balloon, a lawn chair, a conversation too loud on the porch. Is that what you want for your families? A hush spread. One woman whispered to her husband. His jaw tightened. The pen clicked faster. I had touched something raw. Still, the vote carried. Richard smiled without looking at me. A victory drawn in ink. Later, in the parking lot, a neighbor approached a man named Thomas, whose wife chaired the social committee. He spoke low, scanning the lot. "Careful. Richard's not just after you. He's got leverage on people here." "What kind of leverage?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Affairs, money, things that don't look good in daylight." It was confirmation of the whisper I'd overheard before, threads weaving into a net, Richard holding the knots. When I got home, another envelope waited. This one bore official letterhead. Notice of hearing possible grounds for expulsion. The date circled in bold red. I placed it beside the anonymous note. One written in Richard's voice, the other in Richard's shadow, both pointing to the same intent. He wasn't just pushing me out of the neighborhood. He was making sure no one dared stand beside me. I closed the binder with a snap, the papers pressing against one another like conspirators caught in the act. My pulse steadied, not from calm, but from clarity. The war had begun, and Richard had underestimated me. The hearing date loomed like a storm on the calendar. Every time I opened the fridge or checked the clock, my eyes flicked back to the red circle around Thursday. Richard had turned a private divorce into a public trial, and now the HOA was the jury. In the days leading up to it, the neighborhood atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed when I approached. Smiles slipped into silence. At the mailbox, people shuffled faster, keying in their boxes without looking at me. What unsettled me most wasn't the hostility, it was the split. Some avoided me, yes, but others offered fleeting sympathy. A whispered hang in there. A casserole left on my porch without a note. A hand squeezed at the crosswalk. Richard hadn't won everyone. Not yet. Still. His influence spread. A glossy flyer appeared in every mailbox, titled Preserving Our Community. It featured bullet points about compliance, respect, and tradition, with a photo of Richard at the bottom suit, pressed. Smile Solemn identified as legal advisor. It wasn't campaign material, but it read like one. He was branding himself as the neighborhood's savior, painting me as the crack in the foundation. I taught the Crucible that week, guiding students through the madness of Salem. As they debated who bore responsibility for the trials, I felt the irony pressing in. Accusations needed no proof, only momentum. Fear and reputation did the rest. The night of the hearing, the clubhouse brimmed with tension. Folding chairs lined the walls. Residents packed shoulder to shoulder. The air smelled of coffee and hairspray, of too many bodies in too small a space. Valerie sat at the center of the long table, gavel in hand, her lipstick a shade darker than usual. Richard stood beside her, not officially on the board, but positioned like a second spine. The proceedings opened with a recital of the alleged violations. Valerie's voice carried authority, but I saw the tremor in her hands as she shuffled papers. Each violation trash can, fan noise. The clay pot drew polite nods from some and muffled scoffs from others. The absurdity wasn't lost on everyone. When it was my turn, I stood. These charges aren't about property values. They're about a personal vendetta. Richard Carter is my ex-husband. You've heard only his version of me. Tonight, I'll show you another. Murmurs rippled. A man in the back muttered, "Thought so." Another woman glanced at her husband with pursed lips. Before I could continue, Richard rose. "This isn't about our marriage. It's about one resident who refuses to follow the same rules as everyone else." He gestured toward the board. "If we allow exceptions, we undermine the integrity of this community." Integrity. The word slid across the room like oil. I pressed forward. If integrity is the standard, then let's examine it fully. Who drafted these violation notices, Richard? Who met privately with board members, Richard? Who stands to benefit if I'm removed from my home? Richard. Gasps broke from the audience. Valerie tapped the gavel. Order. But her eyes darted, betraying unease. Then a voice from the crowd cut through. "Tell them about the meetings." "Valerie!" Heads whipped toward a man near the aisle. Thomas. He stood, arms crossed, gaze locked on the board president. "You think people don't notice the late nights, the closed blinds in the clubhouse?" The room shifted, weight leaning toward scandal. Valerie's cheeks flushed, Richard's jaw tightened. I didn't add more. I let the silence do the work, the implication expanding like smoke. What Thomas had hinted at an affair, or something close, was more potent than any defense I could craft. Valerie banged the gavel again. "We will not entertain gossip." But her authority cracked, a fissure spreading. The board voted to postpone the decision. "More evidence required," Valerie announced, her voice too quick. The crowd erupted into chatter, neighbors splitting into clusters. Some left early, shaking their heads. Others lingered, whispering, weighing loyalties. As I walked out, a folded paper brushed my shoulder. I caught it before it hit the ground. In block letters, "You're not just fighting him. You're fighting all of us." The ink smeared where a hand had gripped it too tightly. The note burned a hole in my pocket as I walked back to my house that night. "You're not just fighting him. You're fighting all of us." The words carried more than intimidation. They carried numbers faceless. Nameless neighbors aligning themselves behind Richard, hidden in the crowd like shadows. I set the note on the kitchen table and stared at it while the kettle warmed. Steam curled up, but my thoughts stayed cold. Richard wasn't just playing the role of ex-husband turned adversary. He was orchestrating something bigger, a campaign, a stage play. And the neighborhood was his cast. The next morning, whispers turned to open stares. On my walk to the mailbox, I caught sight of two women on their porches. One leaned into the other, murmured. Then both looked away quickly when I met their eyes. In another yard, a father watering the grass froze as if my presence required silence. It was the kind of choreography you see when the script has already been written. Still, not everyone followed the cue. A casserole dish appeared on my porch, covered with foil, unsigned. A neighbor I barely knew whispered at the park, "He's not what he seems." Stay strong. These small rebellions against Richard's narrative were lifelines, proof that his power wasn't complete. But then came the gossip, the kind of rumors designed to spread like mold. At school, a colleague approached me cautiously. "I heard, from someone in your neighborhood, that you've been disruptive, unstable." Her voice trailed off, embarrassed. The lie had reached beyond the subdivision walls. Richard's performance was spilling into my professional life. That evening, Thomas knocked on my door. He looked uneasy, glancing around before stepping inside. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "But you need to know what you're up against." He told me Richard wasn't just pulling strings with Valerie. There were others neighbors with secrets Richard had collected, like currency, affairs, financial missteps, questionable contracts. "He doesn't even have to threaten them," Thomas said. "Just the fact that he knows keeps them obedient." "Why tell me?" I asked. "Because if he can do this to you, he can do it to any of us." I studied him. His voice was firm, but his hands shook. He wasn't just risking his reputation by standing here, he was risking his marriage. His wife was on a committee that relied on Richard's favor. After Thomas left, I sat in the quiet and thought of the invisible strings stretching across the neighborhood. Richard at the center, tugging them one by one. Every rumor, every violation notice, every vote postponed threads woven into a net designed to trap me. 2 days later, the next blow landed. An official letter. Notice of special assessment. According to the board, the HOA needed an emergency fund for legal expenses. Each household would pay, but the sum was suspiciously large. I traced the math and realized the fees matched nearly to the dollar what it would cost to defend the board against accusations of misconduct. They weren't funding the neighborhood. They were funding Richard's war chest. That night, as I added the assessment letter to my binder, I felt the weight grow heavier. Not just paper, but proof. Proof that Richard was bleeding the neighborhood dry to settle a personal vendetta. And still, I sensed something worse underneath, because money and power weren't his only weapons. Secrets were. The following morning, I woke to a new rumor whispered loud enough to reach me. Richard hadn't just moved on, he had moved in. With Valerie. I looked out the window at the clubhouse down the street, its blinds drawn tight. The battle wasn't just about bylaws anymore. It was about betrayal woven into the walls of every house on this street. The rumor about Richard and Valerie wouldn't leave me. It floated through the neighborhood like pollen subtle, carried on whispers, but impossible to ignore. Some spoke it with pity, others with malice. For me, it wasn't about jealousy. It was about strategy. If it was true, Richard had merged his personal vendetta with HOA power at the highest level. That wasn't romance, it was consolidation. I decided to test the truth. The next board meeting. I arrived early and sat near the front, binder of documents on my lap. When Valerie entered, Richard trailed a few steps behind her. Their timing was too precise, their movements too synchronized. She adjusted her papers. He leaned over her shoulder as though the agenda belonged to him. It wasn't proof of intimacy, but it was proof of alignment. As the meeting droned through landscaping contracts and pool hours, I studied the room. Couples avoided each other's eyes, as if secrets buzzed between them. A husband corrected his wife sharply when she mentioned a late-night call. A woman shifted uncomfortably when Richard joked about keeping busy. The air was heavy with more than bylaws, it was heavy with guilt. When the topic turned to the new special assessment, Valerie presented it as routine. Every strong community must invest in its own protection, she said. Her phrasing rang like scripture, rehearsed in Richard's cadence. I raised my hand. What protection requires tens of thousands of dollars with no transparent accounting? Her smile didn't falter. Legal preparedness. Preparedness for what I asked. A lawsuit or the truth. The room stirred. A man in the back snorted. Another whispered too loudly, "She's not wrong." Richard leaned forward, voice smooth as glass. "Emily, this isn't about you. The community faces challenges, and the board is acting responsibly." "Is it responsible?" I countered. "To hire a board member's personal counsel as legal advisor, to funnel assessments into his pocket, to pass motions written in his language." Gasps. Valerie slammed the gavel. "Enough. Personal attacks will not be tolerated." But her cheeks flushed, and Richard's composure cracked for half a second. It was all the confirmation I needed. After the meeting, I gathered my things slowly, waiting. Neighbors brushed past me, murmuring. Some avoided me, others gave subtle nods. One woman slipped a folded note into my binder without a word. At home, I opened it carefully. In shaky handwriting, it read, "He isn't just with Valerie. There are others. Watch the finances. Follow the nights he disappears." The letter smelled faintly of perfume, edges smudged like it had been hidden in a pocket too long. My hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of possibility. Richard's web stretched wider than I'd imagined, not just Valerie, but multiple connections, tangled across households. It explained the tension I'd seen in the meeting, the quick corrections, the guilty glances. He wasn't just manipulating the board. He was exploiting affairs, secrets, and betrayals to build obedience. I placed the note alongside the others in my binder. The story was no longer one of divorce weaponized through bylaws. It was a story of corruption laced with intimacy, of neighbors trapped by their own compromises. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the fan filling the silence. The line between personal and communal had blurred beyond recognition. Richard hadn't just turned our marriage into a battlefield. He'd turned the entire HOA into his chessboard. And if I didn't act soon, I wouldn't just lose my home. I'd lose the one thing still tethering me to truth, the belief that this community could ever be saved from him. I spent that night sorting through the binder, each page a stone in the wall Richard was building around me. Violation notices, assessment letters, anonymous threats, whispered rumors scrawled into my notes together. They painted a portrait of a man using law and loyalty like twin blades. But what struck me most wasn't the official documents. It was the unsigned note, the one warning that Richard wasn't just with Valerie, that there were others. I couldn't shake the image from the last meeting, the sidelong glances, the couples shifting uneasily, the tension buzzing in every corner of the room. If Richard had ensnared multiple neighbors in affairs, then his influence wasn't built on bylaws alone. It was built on silence, on secrets too dangerous to surface. So I decided to dig. The next weekend, I walked the neighborhood under the guise of a morning jog. At each house, I looked for patterns, blinds drawn when they shouldn't be, cars parked in unfamiliar driveways, lights left on at odd hours. It wasn't much, but over time, rhythms reveal fractures. By the third loop, I noticed them subtle mismatches. A husband's car missing when his wife claimed he was homesick. A neighbor's SUV parked outside Valerie's driveway well past midnight. I began logging everything. dates and times scribbled in a notebook. At first it felt invasive, wrong even. But then I remembered Richard's violation photos of my fan and flower pot, and the shame evaporated. If he could weaponize surveillance, so could I. One night, while returning from the grocery store, I saw Richard's car not at his house but outside another board member's home, a sleek townhouse on the far corner of the cul-de-sac. The lights inside glowed dimly, the blinds half closed. My breath caught, not from shock, but from the confirmation that the anonymous note hadn't been exaggeration. Valerie wasn't the only one. The next day, I tested the waters. I approached a neighbor named Claire, a woman known more for her gardening than for gossip. "Strange hours lately," I said casually, nodding toward the cul-de-sac. Her pruning shears stilled. She didn't answer right away, but the hesitation was enough. When she finally spoke, her voice dropped to a whisper. "Careful. People who ask too many questions don't stay long here." Her words chilled me. Not a denial, a warning. That evening, I returned home to find another envelope under my door. No letterhead this time, just handwriting in jagged script. "Drop it. Emily. Or your job won't be safe either." I sank into the chair, fingers gripping the page. My job. Richard had once admired my teaching, told me my students were lucky. Now he was threatening to turn my livelihood into a weapon. It was exactly his style, make the battlefront so wide that surrender feels like the only option. But instead of retreating, I felt something sharper ignite. If Richard was willing to drag my career into this war, then I knew I was closer to the truth than ever. I spread the notes, letters, and photos across the table like a puzzle. A pattern emerged. Every new violation, every anonymous threat, coincided with moments when I pressed too close to the financials, the special assessment, the quiet payments, the legal preparations. Richard wasn't just controlling people with secrets. He was hiding something bigger in the books. The HOA wasn't just a battlefield, it was a bank vault. And Richard had the only key. The realization steadied me. He had underestimated me once before, thinking divorce would silence me. Now he thought fear would stop me. He was wrong. I closed the binder, locking the papers inside. Tomorrow, I would start tracing the money. If Richard had left fingerprints anywhere, it would be on the accounts he thought no one else would dare to look at. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like a hunter. The HOA kept its records in a locked filing cabinet at the clubhouse, a relic of an older board that still believed in paper over pixels. Richard had insisted on outsourcing digital management when he took over as legal counsel, which meant any online trail ran through his firm's software. But paper couldn't be erased with a keystroke. On a Wednesday afternoon, when most residents were at work, I walked into the clubhouse carrying a tote bag and a stack of lesson plans as camouflage. Valerie's assistant barely looked up from her phone when I smiled and said I needed old meeting minutes for a class project on civic procedures. She pointed vaguely toward the filing room. The lock was simple, the kind a determined student could pick with a paperclip. I didn't even need to try. The cabinet stood ajar, as if no one believed anyone would dare open it. Inside were manila folders stacked by month, their tabs handwritten. I leafed through assessments, landscaping invoices, pool maintenance receipts, ordinary life disguised in bureaucratic language. But then I found them transfers labeled Legal Contingency Reserve, authorized by signatures that weren't consistent. Some bore Valerie's sharp scrawl, others a lazy loop that looked suspiciously like Richard's, though he had no legal authority to sign. The numbers didn't add up. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned, often in increments just below the threshold requiring a community vote. The dates aligned perfectly with Richard's late-night visits to Valerie's office and his unexplained appearances at other board members' homes. I snapped photos with my phone, my heart racing with each click. My tote bag felt suddenly heavier, like it held not paper, but dynamite. A noise jolted me. The door creaked, footsteps in the hall. I shoved the folders back and slipped out, clutching my bag tight. Through the glass wall of the clubhouse, I saw Richard entering, phone pressed to his ear, his suit jacket catching the fluorescent light. I ducked behind the vending machine, breath shallow, listening as he passed. "The funds are secured," he said into the phone. "No one's going to challenge us. She doesn't have the guts." His voice was low, confident, rehearsed. I didn't move until his footsteps faded into Valerie's office. Then I slipped out the side door, the night air cold against my skin. At home. I laid out the photos on my dining table, each transfer, each forged signature, each date lined up like dominoes waiting to fall. This wasn't just misuse of HOA funds, it was embezzlement. And if Richard was this bold, then Valerie and perhaps others were complicit. But the threat from the anonymous note echoed in my ears. "Your job won't be safe." Richard had reach. He knew people in education boards, city council, law enforcement. If I moved too soon, he'd bury me under countersuits and whispers. So I needed allies, quiet ones. That evening, I called Thomas. He arrived after dark, his shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the street. When he saw the photos, he exhaled sharply. I knew he was dirty. But this, he shook his head. "This is enough to take him down." "Not yet," I said. "We need more, something that ties him personally to the money, not just Valerie's signatures." Thomas hesitated. "There's one person who might know. My wife. She handles invoices for the social committee. She's seen checks move through accounts that didn't make sense." Silence stretched between us. He was risking his marriage by even suggesting it. "Finally," he muttered. "If she talks, it blows open everything." I leaned forward. "Then we need her. Because the longer Richard thinks I'm cornered, the more reckless he'll get, and that's when he'll slip." Thomas nodded slowly, resolve hardening. Then we move carefully. But we move. As he left, I gathered the photos back into the binder. For the first time, the papers didn't feel like chains. They felt like weapons. And Richard had no idea I was arming myself. Thomas's wife, Linda, didn't answer my call at first. She returned it 3 days later with a voice taut as piano wire. "I can't talk long. Meet me at the park, by the benches near the creek. 10 minutes. Then she hung up. I arrived early, binder tucked under my arm, scanning the playground swings and jogging paths for anyone who didn't belong. When Linda approached, her sunglasses stayed on despite the shade, her steps brisk. She sat without greeting, clutching a folder to her chest. "I shouldn't be here," she said, voice low. "If Richard finds out." She stopped, glancing around. "If my husband finds out, he'll be ruined too." I tried to soften my tone. "I'm not here to expose anyone who doesn't deserve it. I just need the truth." She handed me the folder. Inside were copies of checks made out to Community Legal Fund, but the endorsements didn't match. Some were deposited into the HOA account, others into an account under a different name, RC Consulting. LLC. My throat tightened. Richard had literally signed his initials onto a shell company. He wasn't even hiding it well, just enough to intimidate neighbors into silence. Linda leaned closer. "He pays people off with this money. Not just Valerie. He's got at least 2 others tied to him. One of them lives across from you. That's why the board votes the way he wants. They're scared of what he'll reveal if they break rank." The words landed like stones. Across from me was the Martinez house, the couple who had always smiled tightly but rarely spoke. Suddenly their guarded expressions, their tense posture at meetings, made sense. "Why give me this?" I asked. "Because it's bigger than you or me," she whispered. "And because if he keeps going, he'll sink us all." She stood abruptly, pulling her sunglasses tighter. "Don't contact me again." I watched her disappear down the trail, folder still in my hands. The weight of it pressed hard, heavier than the binder had ever felt. That night, I spread the new documents across the table, arranging them beside the photos I had taken from the filing cabinet. The pattern sharpened, HOA fees rerouted through RC Consulting, payouts disguised as reimbursements, signatures alternating between Valerie and Richard. The money trail was undeniable now, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Richard's strength was narrative. He spun stories people wanted to believe that I was disruptive, that the board was unified, that compliance equaled community. To beat him, I'd need to fracture that story in front of the same audience he had captivated. As I stared at the paperwork, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You think paper will save you? Wait until the board hears about your affair. My chest went hollow. Affair I had none. But the message was never about truth. It was about poison. Richard was preparing his counterattack, planting rumors before I could plant proof. I typed back before I could stop myself. I don't scare that easily. No reply came. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion settling over me. But beneath it, something sharper grew. If Richard was fabricating lies about me, it meant he knew I had something real on him. And the harder he pushed, the closer I was to breaking his hold. I gathered every page into the binder and locked it shut. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Eyes dark, jaw set. I wasn't the woman he had once controlled in our marriage. I wasn't even the woman who flinched at anonymous notes. I was the woman who had the map of his empire, and I was ready to strike it at its foundation. The next board meeting would be the stage, and this time, I wouldn't walk in alone. The night of the board meeting, the clubhouse felt less like a civic hall and more like a courtroom. Every folding chair was filled, neighbors pressed shoulder to shoulder, whispers rippling across the room like a current before a storm. I walked in with my binder tucked tightly under my arm, my pulse steady despite the weight of eyes following me. This was the night Richard had orchestrated for months, the night he expected me to fall. Valerie sat at the center of the long table, face composed but stiff. Richard stood to her right, not officially a board member, but poised as though he owned the room. He wore the same blue suit he had worn during our divorce hearings, as if to remind me of past defeats. I didn't flinch. The meeting opened with routine business landscaping bids, pool hours, neighborhood watch, but the air was too charged for small matters. Everyone knew why they were here. When Valerie cleared her throat and read the agenda item, the tension crystallized. Consideration of resident expulsion. Emily Carter. Richard rose immediately, voice polished. This is not personal, he began. The words, a familiar mask. This is about one individual who repeatedly undermines our community standards, who spreads division, who refuses to comply with the rules we all live by. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. A few nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. Richard's cadence carried authority, the rhythm of a lawyer shaping truth into weapon. When he finished, I stood. If this isn't personal, then why has every violation against me been drafted in my ex-husband's handwriting? Why have HOA funds been rerouted into an account he controls? Why are board members suddenly flush with favors no one can explain? The room erupted, some voices calling for silence, others demanding answers. Valerie slammed the gavel, her voice cracking as she tried to restore order. I opened the binder and laid the documents across the table for all to see. Photos of forged signatures, copies of checks to RC Consulting, LLC, meeting minutes that didn't match official filings. Gasps sharpened into shouts. A neighbor stood. That's my signature only. I never signed that form. Another voice shouted, Where's our money? Valerie Richards' composure faltered for the first time. He leaned forward, voice sharp. This is fabrication. She's desperate, bitter. She'll say anything to save herself. I didn't respond to him. Instead, I looked directly at the crowd. You trusted this board to safeguard your homes, your money, your peace. Instead, they've been siphoning funds and using your silence to cover their tracks. Ask yourselves, why are so many of you suddenly in debt to Richard Carter? Heads turned toward one another. A woman near the front lowered her gaze, her husband's hand tightening on her arm. A man in the back shouted, "Is this why you threatened me to stay quiet?" Valerie slammed the gavel again, but her voice wavered. "Order. We will not indulge baseless accusations." "Baseless?" I cut in. "Then explain this." I held up the folder Linda had given me. The checks endorsed into Richard's shell company. Your signatures, Valerie, your meetings, your cover-ups. The room fractured into chaos. Neighbors stood, shouting across aisles. Some at Richard, some at me, some at each other. Secrets spilled in fragments, mentions of late-night visits, unexplained deposits, whispered threats. The walls of silence Richard had built were crumbling under their own weight. Through it all, Richard's face hardened, jaw tight, eyes darting as though calculating exits. For once, his words failed him. I gathered the papers back into my binder and stepped away from the table. "This isn't my trial anymore," I said, my voice carrying above the noise. "It's his, and for the first time since our marriage ended." Richard looked unsettled, truly unsettled. The gavel struck again and again, but no one was listening to Valerie anymore. The clubhouse had become a storm, voices colliding like waves against rocks. Some neighbors shouted for Richard to explain the checks. Others demanded Valerie step down. Couples argued openly, fingers pointing, secrets spilling. I stood still, binder against my chest, watching the unraveling. For months, Richard had orchestrated every move with precision, his words rehearsed, his timing flawless. But now the performance was breaking, and the actors no longer followed his script. Richard finally slammed his own hand on the table. Enough. His voice sliced through the noise. "She's manipulating all of you. These so-called documents, copies, forgeries. None of it would hold in court. You're letting a bitter ex-wife tear apart this community." He turned his glare on me, his eyes burning with a rage he used to hide behind charm. "Tell them, Emily, tell them you doctored those papers. Tell them you invented a company out of thin air because you couldn't stand to lose." I took a step forward. "Steady. Why don't you tell them where the money went?" "Richard. Or should I let the bank statement speak for you?" I opened the binder again and pulled out the clearest piece of evidence, a check written to RC Consulting, LLC, deposited directly into an account under Richard's name. Gasps rippled across the room. A neighbor in the second row muttered. He didn't even bother to hide it. Richard's face flushed deep red. "This is slander. You'll pay for this." But before I could answer, another voice rose from the crowd. Thomas stood near the back, his wife clutching his arm. "She's telling the truth. I've seen the payments, too. My wife handled committee invoices. She knows where the money went." The room tilted. All eyes swung toward Valerie. Her mask cracked at last, lips trembling as she tried to compose herself. This is being blown out of proportion. Is that why you spent nights at the clubhouse with him?" another neighbor shouted. "We've all seen the lights on after midnight." Gasps. Sharper this time. Valerie's cheeks flamed. She banged the gavel so hard the wood splintered. "This meeting is adjourned, but no one left." The air was too thick with revelations, too electric with betrayal. Voices rose, neighbors arguing over whose secrets were tied to Richard, whose loyalties had been bought, whose silence had been coerced. Through it all, Richard's control slipped further. He shouted over the din, but each denial rang weaker than the last. His hands clenched the edge of the table, knuckles white. For a man who once wielded words like weapons, he now looked cornered by the very crowd he thought he commanded. I took one final step toward him. "This isn't my destruction, Richard. It's yours. You built your empire on fear and secrets. Tonight, it all belongs to everyone watching." Neighbors lifted phones, recording, snapping photos, documenting every crack in the facade. The story he had crafted so carefully was now a spectacle beyond his control. Richard's eyes met mine, no longer calm, no longer composed. For the first time since I had known him, I saw panic. The noise inside the clubhouse swelled until it no longer resembled a meeting. It was a reckoning. Neighbors clustered into factions, some furious, some stunned silent, others frantically recording on their phones as if afraid the moment might vanish before it was captured. Valerie tried once more to seize control, her voice straining against the uproar. Everyone, please let's not jump to conclusions. The board will review these allegations, but her words dissolved beneath a shouted question from the back. With Richard as your puppet master, you've been covering for him for months. The accusation ignited fresh chaos. A woman stood up, trembling, and pointed toward Richard. He told me he'd ruin my family if I didn't support him. He threatened to expose my husband. Tears streaked her face, but her voice was steady. I stayed quiet because I was scared. Not anymore. Gasps cut through the air. Heads turned toward Richard, who raised his hands in feigned calm. This is absurd. She's lying trying to protect herself, but the room had already shifted. Neighbors murmured, connecting their own uneasy experiences, unexplained fines, hushed favors, meetings behind closed doors. Each story echoed the next until Richard's denials sounded hollow against the mounting chorus. I stepped forward, laying the final set of documents on the table, a ledger showing funds routed through RC Consulting, LLC, Richard's initials scrawled in bold ink. This isn't bitterness, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. This is theft. Every dollar you paid into this community was twisted into his personal account, and every threat he made kept you silent while he bled us dry. Phones rose higher. Red recording lights dotted the room. Richard's face flushed crimson, his composure fracturing in real time. He slammed a fist against the table, sending papers scattering. You think this proves anything? I built this neighborhood. I kept it together while all of you coasted. Without me, you'd drown in lawsuits and debt. Valerie reached for his arm, whispering urgently, but he shook her off. His voice cracked, no longer measured, no longer the polished attorney. You're all ungrateful. Every one of you owes me. That was the moment his unraveling, his mask fully stripped away. The neighbors who once sat silent were now shouting back, no longer afraid. Someone yelled, "Call the police." Another, "Audit the accounts." The tide had turned. I closed the binder with deliberate calm, the sound sharp against the uproar. You wanted this to be my expulsion, Richard. Instead, it's your exposure. Richard spun toward me, finger pointed, rage consuming what little restraint he had left. You'll regret this, Emily. I'll drag you down with me. But his threat fell flat, drowned by the voices rising against him. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. The community he had controlled with secrecy and fear was now staring at him with something stronger than suspicion, conviction. And as Valerie fumbled for the gavel, her hands trembling, I knew the confrontation Richard had engineered had slipped beyond his control. The question was no longer whether he would fall. It was how hard. The police arrived before the shouting died down. 2 officers stepped into the clubhouse, their presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. Neighbors who moments earlier were screaming, now hushed, their voices dropping to whispers as if the uniforms themselves demanded silence. Richard straightened his suit jacket, his face a mask of forced composure. Officers, he began smoothly, thank you for coming. This has gotten out of hand. I'm the HOA's legal counsel, and I assure you, sir. One officer interrupted. We'll need you to step aside. His tone left no room for argument. Phones were still recording. I saw the glow of a dozen screens raised like lanterns in the dim clubhouse. Every eye followed as the officers walked to the board table, as they scanned the documents scattered across it, checks, ledgers, the folder marked RC Consulting, LLC, Valerie tried to intervene. This is all a misunderstanding. We can resolve it internally, but the second officer shook his head. Financial records like these don't get resolved internally. They get investigated. The words landed like a verdict. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half relief, half disbelief. For months, Richard had stood untouchable, his voice louder than any complaint, his authority stronger than any neighbor's protest. Now, under fluorescent lights and the unblinking gaze of his own community, that power was slipping through his fingers. Richard's control broke. This is harassment. You're all fools if you think she isn't manipulating you. His finger jabbed toward me, trembling with rage. Emily has fabricated every word, every paper. She's obsessed. Vindictive, she wants to destroy me because she couldn't keep our marriage alive. The words hit the room like sparks, but instead of igniting support, they fizzled into silence. Neighbors who once might have believed him now stared with hardened eyes. The narrative he had crafted for months collapsed under the weight of evidence and his own unraveling. I stepped forward, my voice steady. This isn't about a failed marriage. This is about theft, about betrayal, about an entire community held hostage by one man's greed. I turned to the neighbors, letting my gaze meet theirs. We all saw it. We all lived it. Tonight, it ends. The officers collected the documents into evidence bags. One of them spoke into his radio, requesting additional units. Richard sputtered, shouting about constitutional rights, about slander and due process. But no one moved to help him. Valerie sat frozen, her gavel forgotten, her face pale as chalk. And then it happened. The officer closest to Richard placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Sir, you're going to need to come with us." Gasps echoed, followed by an almost eerie quiet. For a heartbeat, the entire neighborhood held its breath. Richard jerked his arm free, but the officer tightened his grip. The sight of the once untouchable Richard Carter being led toward the door shifted something in the air like the first crack in a dam before it bursts. I didn't move. I didn't cheer. I simply stood and watched as the man who had turned my life, and the lives of my neighbors, into a battlefield was escorted out under the eyes of those he once controlled. And in that silence, broken only by the shuffle of footsteps and the faint click of handcuffs, I realized justice had finally stepped through the gates of our neighborhood. The door closed behind Richard, and the silence in the clubhouse felt almost sacred, as if the air itself were trying to process what had just happened. For months, his voice had dominated these walls, dictating rules, drafting punishments, weaving lies into policies. Now there was only the echo of his absence. Valerie sat rigid at the head of the table, her gavel resting uselessly at her side. The room's attention shifted to her like a tide turning, eyes narrowing, whispers sharpening. She tried to muster authority, but her words faltered. We should all go home for tonight. The board will reconvene once things settle." But no one moved. A voice rose from the crowd, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood longer than any of us. "You let him steal from us. You let him use us." His words cut through the quiet like a blade. Another neighbor stood. "You knew. You signed the checks." Valerie's face blanched, her lipstick trembling at the corner of her mouth. I thought it was legitimate legal work," Richard said. Her excuses collapsed under the weight of her own guilt. The neighbors had tasted truth, and they weren't about to swallow lies again. Thomas stepped forward, his wife at his side, both of them pale but resolute. "The board needs to dissolve. Tonight, no more closed doors, no more secret votes. We start over." The call ignited the room. Neighbors nodded, some clapping softly, others voicing agreement. For the first time in months, the energy wasn't fear or division, it was unity. Valerie slumped back in her chair, realizing her reign was finished. She didn't resign, Not formally, but the decision had already been made by the people in the room. Power had shifted, and it wasn't hers anymore. I stood, binder still in hand, though I no longer needed it. We rebuild, I said simply, transparent, accountable, and free from personal vendettas. My voice carried not just to the board, but to every neighbor who had watched this community corrode under Richard's control. A woman near the front, one who had avoided my eyes for months, finally met my gaze. "You saved us," she whispered, though loud enough for others to hear. "You saved all of us." I shook my head. We saved ourselves. All I did was refuse to stay silent. There was no applause, no triumphant cheer. Instead, there was something quieter, stronger, a collective exhale, relief, the knowledge that we had endured the storm and could finally step into calm. Neighbors began filing out, their conversations hushed but hopeful. Plans for a new election, talk of independent audits, promises to never let such secrecy rot the neighborhood again. For the first time, the future felt possible. As the room emptied, I lingered, my hand resting on the binder. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder of how fragile trust could be, of how quickly power could twist a community, of how necessary it was to stand when standing meant standing alone. And yet, tonight, I was no longer alone. When I stepped outside, the night air was cool, carrying the sound of crickets instead of conflict. For the first time in months, the street didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home. The days that followed felt unreal, as if the neighborhood had been scrubbed clean of the shadows that once clung to every sidewalk and porch light. Richard's absence was a wound, but it was also a cure. The constant surveillance, the whispered threats, the weight of his presence all gone in a single night. The police investigation moved quickly. News traveled even faster. Within a week, word spread that Richard faced charges for fraud, embezzlement, and misconduct. His law firm severed ties, distancing itself from the scandal that now bore his name. Neighbors who once feared him now spoke of him in past tense, as if he were already history. Valerie resigned quietly. Her letter slipped under doorsteps rather than announced in person. No one bothered to defend her. The HOA board dissolved, replaced by a temporary committee tasked with rebuilding from the ground up. For the first time, meetings were held with open doors, agendas printed in advance, finances displayed for all to see. Transparency became our new currency. I attended those first gatherings not as a defendant, not as a target, but as a neighbor. People who once avoided my eyes now sought me out, their words halting but sincere. "You were right. I'm sorry I doubted you. Thank you for not giving up." Each confession stitched back pieces of the trust Richard had torn apart. Yet beneath the relief lingered a question I couldn't silence. How had we let it happen? How had one man twisted grief, power, and desire into a weapon that nearly destroyed us? One evening, as I walked past the clubhouse, its blinds open now, its lights warm rather than secretive, I paused at the bench outside. The binder rested on my lap, filled with evidence no longer needed in court, but preserved as a record of what we had endured. I thought of the clay pot still on my porch, turquoise and gold, its colors fading but intact. Richard had tried to strip me of everything: my home, my career, my dignity, but that pot remained, stubborn and unbroken, a relic of family and resilience. I lifted my eyes to the houses lined neatly in rows, their windows glowing with ordinary life, children laughing, couples cooking dinner, dogs barking in yards. We had survived the battlefield, but scars remained. Trust would take time. Healing would take work. As I rose to leave, I turned one final question over in my mind. A question that belonged not only to me, but to every neighbor who had lived through the storm. When love curdles into war and secrets turn neighbors into soldiers, How can any community ever truly know who stands beside them and who waits to betray them?